The silence wasn't the most haunting part. It was the backpack left by the swings in Magnolia Park unzipped, with a juice box still inside. No footprints in the dirt. No cries for help. Just a soft breeze, the sun slipping below the horizon, and a sparkly pink backpack that should have gone home with Lily Walker. She was 9, brown hair tied in a braid. Her favorite shoes were rainbow-colored sneakers, bright, quiet, and never late, always through the front door by 4:15. But today, she wasn't. By 4:32 p.m., her mother had already called the school. 7 minutes later, she was circling the neighborhood in her car. At 5:10, deputies had off the entire park with yellow tape, and a search perimeter was being drawn. People turned up quickly, neighbors, school staff, even high school kids with flashlights. They combed through trees, checked behind sheds, and shouted her name into the underbrush. But as night crept in, and the air grew colder across the small Oregon town, voices dimmed, flashlights flickered out, and hope began to wane. Officer Daniel Ruiz was into his 14th hour on duty when the call came through. Another missing child. Another desperate family. Another race against time. He looked down at his partner, Echo. The German shepherd sat alert by the patrol car still, tongue curled, ears up. A little older than most working dogs, Echo wasn't known for speed or flash. He had something different, an instinct that couldn't be trained. Don didn't know how to explain it, but Echo always knew where to pause, which door to hesitate at, which corner needed more than a passing glance. When others moved on, Echo stayed. And sometimes that was the difference. They arrived at Magnolia Park at 6:42 p.m. The atmosphere was tense. News vans lined the edge of the grass. Flashlights bobbed across the field. A drone hovered somewhere overhead. A volunteer handed Dan a laminated search map. She disappeared right after school, the man said. Last seen alone on the swings. Then, nothing. The backpack turned up here. He gestured toward the base of a slide. Don nodded and clipped on Echo's leash. Time to work. Echo lowered his nose and began weaving through the grass. Past benches, toward the trees. For 15 minutes, he sniffed, looped back, and then stopped at a chain-link fence. He sat still, the wind tugging at his fur. Dan noted the change. Something had caught his attention. Echo moved again, now in the direction of the creek running. Beneath the park, up ahead, was a concrete drainage pipe, rusted, moss-covered, gaping open. Echo halted. He stared into the tunnel, tail low, body tense. Then he let out a soft whimper, not a bark, a mournful, grieving sound. Don stepped closer and shined his flashlight into the darkness. Concrete walls, damp leaves, no movement, no sound. A search leader behind him spoke. Already checked. Drain tunnel, too narrow. Just runoff. Doesn't lead far. Echo disagrees, Don replied. He's probably picking up an old trail, maybe. Don could have led Echo elsewhere, but each time he called him away, Echo returned, same spot, same tunnel, same unblinking focus. Midnight came, most of the searchers left. Rain began to fall. Lily still hadn't been found. The next morning's headlines said what no one wanted to hear. Search for Lily Walker ends with no leads. Back at the sheriff's office, Don sat staring at a map covered in pins and notes. Echo lay on the floor. Beside him, quiet but watchful. Every so often, his gaze flicked to the door. You still think she's out there? Dan asked softly. Don asked, softly. Echo didn't move. Dan stood, grabbed his coat. They returned to the park. No cameras, no search crews. Just damp earth and the first light of morning. Echo leapt from the cruiser before the engine had fully stopped. He went straight to the pipe. Dan followed. There was something different about Echo's posture, rigid, insistent. He wasn't pointing something out. He was pleading to be believed. Don crouched. Okay, one more time. He aimed his flashlight into the drain. Same darkness. Then some. He thought he saw motion, blinked, nothing. He turned off the light and waited. Seconds passed, then a faint sound, fabric scraping against concrete. A hand, small, trembling, pal emerged from behind a curve in the tunnel. fingers stretching outward, barely moving. Dan's heart nearly stopped. "Lily," he whispered. He called for help, paramedics, fire rescue, backup, crawled into the pipe as far as he could, guiding her gently with his voice. When they pulled her out, she was soaked through, shivering, barely conscious. Dehydrated, cold, but alive. Wrapped in a metallic blanket, she whispered, just loud enough for Dan to hear. "I heard the dog." Dan leaned in. "What? The dog?" "He was there. I didn't fall asleep because I could hear him." Echo sat by the stretcher, gently licking her wrist as medics worked. His tail wagged once. Later, they learned she'd been followed after school by a man. In a hoodie, no one noticed. She ran, terrified, slipping through brush and crawling into the storm drain to hide. In the dark, she got turned around and dozed off. When it rained, she stayed put, afraid to move. Afraid she'd never find her way out. She said she didn't think anyone was coming, until she heard the dog. That part never made the evening news. They showed the rescue, the flashing lights, the joyful reunion. But not the dog who stood guard at a tunnel entrance when others had gone home. Not the whimper that broke through the silence. But Lily remembered. So did Dan, and Echo. He didn't need to. The local paper called it a miracle. Missing girl rescued from storm. Drained thanks to police dog. The front page showed Lily wrapped in an emergency blanket, her face pale, eyes open. Echo sat next to her, still and calm. The picture of quiet loyalty. By the next morning, though the headlines had moved on, reporters chased news stories. Lily recovered in the hospital. Her parents thanked every higher power they knew. But the questions began to swirl. Whispers, doubts. She must have gone in there on her own. Why didn't she call out? We even sure it was an abduction. At the precinct, Dan found a manila envelope on his desk. Marked, Lily Walker internal note. Inside the envelope were neatly typed reports, timelines, assessments, and notes from a behavioral specialist in Salem. One phrase stood out. Underlined in bold ink, possible fabrication or trauma-induced confusion. Dan stared at those words, unmoving. Then he glanced down at Echo, who lay curled at his feet, tail twitching faintly. She didn't make it up, he murmured. Ekko opened one eye. Dan recognized the look immediately. The one that meant, "We're not done yet." A few days later, Dan visited the hospital. Lily was awake, but still quiet. Her parents sat nearby, polite but worn down. The room held a thick stillness, as if everyone was waiting for something, an explanation. Maybe even blame. Lily hadn't said much, but when she spotted Echo, her expression changed. She brightened, motioning him closer. Echo padded over to her bed and rested his head on the mattress. That's when she whispered, "He came back." Dan knelt beside her. "Do you remember what happened?" She gave a slow nod. "I ran. There was a man. Wearing dark clothes. I think. He was following me. Did you see his face?" She shook her head. "No, just boots." And his voice. "He told me to stop." Don felt a knot tighten in his chest. "So you hid in the pipe." "I was going to wait until he left. But it got dark. I got lost. I fell asleep. But I heard Echo outside. He was the only one. I wasn't invisible anymore." Dan wrote up a full report and submitted it. It was quietly filed away. No follow-up, no formal reinvestigation. The sheriff's office had no footage, no solid proof of a kidnapping, just a frightened child's account. They chalked it up to panic, a misinterpreted situation. The case was closed. But Dan knew better. And so did Echo. He returned to the park alone. The storm drain had since been sealed off with temporary fencing, but the surrounding area still felt off, not the pipe, specifically, but something beyond it. A strange stillness that didn't sit right. Echo picked up on it immediately. He didn't bark, he just watched. Focused. Dan let him lead. They moved past the edge of the park, through dense brush and into a patch of woods that bordered an old storage yard and a little used service road. 100 yards in, Echo stopped. Head low, sniffing tight circles into the ground. Don followed. What is it? Echo halted beside a tree, where the grass had been flattened. Next to the trunk lay something smaller, crumpled juice box. Dan's stomach turned. It was the same brand as the one in Lily's bag. He knelt down. You're saying she came this far? Echo wagged once. They kept searching. Over the next hour, more signs appeared. A large, partial footprint. A strip of torn fabric tangled in barbed wire. Don documented everything. It wasn't definitive, but it was enough to raise questions. That night, he brought the evidence to someone he trusted, Mia Reynolds, a local crime analyst and former Portland PD investigator who'd left city work after burnout caught up to her. After reviewing the search area and layout, she leaned back in her chair. She was chased, she said. She didn't just panic, she was running from something. Don nodded, but no one's listening. They don't want to listen, Mia replied. Because if they do, they have to admit something worse. Out there, targeting kids in public parks. Think the mayor wants that story floating around. Dan looked away. So what do we do? Mia slid the juice box back toward him. We keep looking quietly, so they did. Dan and Echo returned night after night, and each time, Echo led them to something new. A scent trail by a utility shed. A rusted flashlight buried under branches. A bent section of fence tied back with zip ties. Too many strange details, not enough to prove anything. Don kept detailed records at home. If the department wouldn't investigate, he would off the books. Then, on Friday night, Echo did something he hadn't done since they found Lily. He sat beside a stack of rocks and let out a low, mournful whimper. Dan knelt down and shifted the stones. Beneath them, in a shallow hole, was a torn black hoodie, too small for an adult, too large for a child. He checked the pocket. Inside a burner phone, dead. He held it up to the light. Got you. Back at home, Dan hooked it to a charger. The phone powered on. No messages, no call history, no contacts, just one photo in the gallery. It was a grainy image of the Magnolia Park entrance sign. Time-stamped 2 hours before Lily disappeared. Whoever had taken it had been watching. Don called Mia. You were right. By the next morning, the phone's cloud backup had been traced to a disposable email address linked to 3 other burner phones, each connected to suspicious loitering incidents across the state. Outside elementary schools, daycare centers, and a public pool. The pattern was there. The man was mobile, careful, and now gone. Dan walked into the station Monday morning and placed the phone on the captain's desk. You need to reopen the case. The captain raised an eyebrow. Where did this come from? Off the books, Dan said. Echo found it. You understand that this doesn't follow standard chain of custody. Dan leaned in. Chain of custody didn't find Lily. The room fell silent. He straightened. I'm not looking for a headline, but there's someone out there, and he's not finished. The captain leaned back in his chair slowly. I'll take it from here, quietly. But don't go off script again. Dan gave a single nod before turning away, Echo trailing him. That evening, he dropped by to see Lily. She was coloring with crayons, sketching out stick figures and basic shapes. One drawing was of a dog. When she noticed Dan, her face lit up. Told Mum I want to be like Echo when I grow up, she said with a smile. Dan chuckled. You mean strong and quiet? She nodded, and brave. Echo gently nudged her hand with his nose, earning a giggle. Back at his place, Dan returned to his investigation board. It wasn't just a single pin anymore. Now, 6 towns were marked. 6 parks. 6 missing girls each, one found quickly, frightened but physically unharmed. Every town had one thing in common. A black SUV caught on local gas station cameras. Dan placed a grainy image of the vehicle in the center of the board. Beneath it, Echo lay silently, eyes locked on the wall of pins and photos. As if he understood what was unfolding. This wasn't the end. Not even close. Echo stood at the edge of the room, staring at the map. 6 pins, 6 towns, 6 girls, and 1 dark SUV. Don Ruiz hadn't slept in nearly 30 hours. The coffee had stopped helping it, just made his hands tremble more. He had a folder overflowing with grainy screenshots from surveillance cameras, timestamps, informal notes, and anonymous tips scribbled in pen. But still, no suspect, no name, no face. He glanced down at Echo, who remained alert, tail twitching, like a metronome. You ready to find him? Dan asked. Ekko stood. That was answer enough. The SUV's last confirmed sighting had been near a place called Silverside, just under 2 hours to the east. Mostly orchards and rural truck stops. The area was quiet. Local law enforcement had dismissed it as just a random traveler passing through. Dan no longer believed in coincidences. He loaded Echo into the back of his unmarked SUV and hit the road before sunrise. No lights, no sirens, no team. Just a man and his dog chasing something the system had overlooked. They reached Silverside by 8:15 a.m. Dan didn't bother with the local station. Instead, he drove straight to the last place the SUV had been seen, a convenience store lot off Route 39. The store clerk remembered it clearly. Black, tinted windows. Driver never got out, just sat there for a while. Did you catch the plate? Dan asked. The clerk scratched his chin. No front plate. Felt kind of sketchy, to be honest. Dan pulled up a blurry frame from one of the cameras on his phone. That's it, the clerk confirmed. That's the one. Dan and Echo canvassed the area for about an hour. Echo sniffed around the parking lot, then made his way behind the building to a drainage ditch, which bordered a thick tree line. That's where he stopped. Dan recognized the posture. Is perked, body tense, tail low but alert. You got something? Echo moved forward, cautiously but focused. They followed the trail over a bent wire fence into the woods, where they found a clearing with a half-collapsed barn at its center. Rusted tools still hung from its weathered exterior. Echo paused at the barn door and gave a sharp bark. Dan drew his sidearm and stepped inside. The air was damp, the smell of mold and gasoline thick. In a corner, several old tarps covered something. Echo growled, approaching them. Don pulled one tarp aside. Underneath were plastic storage bins. One was filled with fast food wrappers. Another held duct tape and zip ties. The third, children's clothing. Dan froze when he saw a pink shoe and a red backpack with worn-out stickers. He took photos carefully, avoiding contact. Echo barked again, louder this time. Behind a pile of old hay, they found a trapdoor. Dan lifted it. A short tunnel stretched out beneath, no more than 15 feet, long, reinforced with plywood, and dug directly into the ground. Ekko refused to enter. He sat at the entrance and whined softly. That was enough. Dan backed away, pulse racing. He called Mia. You're not going to believe what we just found, he said, texting her the coordinates and images. This guy's not just drifting around. He's setting up spots. Safe zones. Mia's reply came quickly. Predators sometimes do that. Stash houses, prep zones. It's worse than we thought. Dan nodded to himself. Yeah, much worse. He wanted to stay, to wait and see if the suspect returned. But instinct and protocol told him to report it and step back. They needed a net, not a firefight. He flagged the location through a trusted task force contact, anonymously. It might buy them time. Then he and Echo returned to the highway. They stopped for gas. While Dan filled the tank, Echo growled low. Dan followed his gaze. Across the street, parked by a line of mailboxes, sat a black SUV. Tinted windows, engine running, no license plate. Dan's heart pounded. He reached for his radio but hesitated. No warrant, no jurisdiction, no probable cause. But he had Echo, and Echo wasn't looking away. Don decided to trust him. He got back in the SUV and looped casually through the neighborhood. Eventually, he parked behind a taco truck, keeping the black SUV in sight. Engine off. All right, buddy, he whispered. Let's find out who this guy is. 10 minutes passed. Then the driver's door opened. A man stepped out, hoodie, baseball cap, jeans, clean shoes. No visible weapons. He walked to the back of the SUV and pulled out a trash bag. Dan squinted. It looked heavy. The man carried it behind a nearby shed and disappeared from view. Dan exited his vehicle, Echo at his side. They moved quietly, hugging walls and dumpsters. At the edge of the shed, Dan peeked around. The man was kneeling, digging a shallow hole. Dan raised his phone and took several photos. Then he stepped out. "Sheriff's Department, don't move." The man froze then bolted. Echo, track. The dog launched forward, fast and precise. The man got maybe 50 yards before Echo brought him down hard. Dan cuffed him seconds later. Backup. Arrived not long after, Don had already recovered the trash bag. Inside were dozens of photographs of children at parks, schoolyards and playgrounds. Some recent, others older. None of them belonged to the man. He was arrested for stalking and suspected child endangerment. He refused to speak without an attorney. But the contents of that bag were enough to spark major federal interest. That night, Dan sat outside the station. Echo lay beside him, calm but alert. "Mia called," he said aloud. She said, "You did it." Don shook his head. "No, we did." He looked at Echo. He did. The next morning, Dan went to visit Lily again. She seemed stronger, now smiling. More often, when she spotted him, she ran straight to Echo and wrapped her arms around him. "I knew he was magic." She beamed. Dan laughed. "He's just a dog." She shook her head. "No, he's the dog." Later, back at the house, Don placed one last pin into the board silver side. Echo lay at his feet, finally at rest, his breathing slow and steady for the first time in days. But Dan couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Because monsters rarely stop on their own. They stop when something or someone like Echo refuses to let them slip away. Don wasn't interested in recognition. After the black SUV was secured, after the disturbing photos were entered into evidence, and once the FBI quietly stepped in to take over the growing multi-state investigation, the mayor's office decided to spin the moment. They gave Echo a plaque, pinned a ribbon to his collar, and offered Dan a place in a carefully posed press event. He declined it all. What he needed wasn't applause. What he needed was answers. He needed to know who this man in custody really was, and what he'd done beyond just watching. Don needed proof that it hadn't just been about stalking or surveillance. He feared something darker had already happened at home. Echo couldn't settle. He paced the hall at night, let out soft whines near the basement door, and stood at the windows with his ears low, gaze fixed. "He knows it's not over," Don said to Mia during a late call. "It's not just behavior. He feels it." Mia didn't disagree. Dogs like Echo, they're like tuning forks for pain. He might not understand what's wrong, but he knows something is. Don ran a hand across his forehead. "He's not talking." The guy they brought in, nothing. No confessions. No locations. But those maps. Each one led to a stash. Hidden supplies. Still no victims. The next morning, as Dan sifted through old case notes, Echo barked sharp and sudden. Not just a bark, a signal. Don followed him into the hall. Echo stood still, nose locked on the floor vent. He gave a soft whimper, then tapped the metal with one paw. Don crouched. The vent was icy. Something was beneath it, grabbing a screwdriver. He loosened the cover and pulled it free. What he saw made his stomach drop. A small, fabric-covered notebook was wedged deep inside, hidden, as if someone never meant for it to be found. Dan carefully removed it and dusted off the surface. It was a diary. A child's, the name inside, Samantha D. The date, October 12, 2016. Older than Lily, Don brought it to Mia. She read slowly, carefully, as if the pages might tear apart from the weight of the words. "This girl writes about being locked up," she whispered, about hearing footsteps, voices, someone who left food but never let her out. Dan clenched his fists. Was she ever reported missing? Mia ran the name. Nothing came up. But the writing was raw, the fear, real. Too many vivid details for fiction. That, at the very back, there was a drawing of a dog. Underneath, the words, "I heard him, But he didn't find me. Dan's chest tightened. This wasn't Lily, he said. No, Mia replied quietly. Someone before her. Dan returned to the barn outside Silverside, now locked down with federal tape. He called in a favor to gain quiet access. Inside, Echo moved differently. This time, he headed to the back wall, sat down, and pawed gently at the floor. Don peeled back the boards another space. Another tunnel, inside, an old blanket, empty juice boxes, and a pair of dusty ballet slippers. Dan's breath caught in his throat. They had missed. Someone. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in. Cadaver dogs followed. 3 more hidden spaces were found, all empty but clearly lived in. The classification changed. This was no longer a missing persons case. It was serial abduction. Don stood at the edge of one of the dugouts. How many didn't we save? He murmured. Ekko let out a soft whimper. Then barked at nothing, or maybe at something only he could sense. That night, Don sat beside Echo and reopened the diary. He read it cover to cover, this time marking every mention of names, places, or times. One detail kept repeating. The house with yellow stairs. Dan mentioned it to Mia. No street, no city. Just that phrase, over and over. Mia frowned. It's not much. Echo doesn't need much. They spent the next few days combing rural roads, searching miles of forgotten land. Echo rode up front now, more alert than ever. They passed farms, toolsheds, shuttered motels. Nothing. Until Thursday morning, pulled into a gas station for coffee. When he returned, Echo was standing on the hood of the SUV, posture stiff, ears forward. Dan's heart thudded. What is it? Echo leapt down and sprinted toward a nearby property. An old ranch house, set back from the road. The yard was overgrown, and at the front, porch faded, cracked, were yellow-painted wooden stairs. Dan's gut twisted. He radioed it in as a welfare check. Standard procedure. A young deputy arrived, looked uncertain. Don flashed his badge. I'll take lead. They knocked 3 times. No answer. The windows were intact, but covered. Don circled around to the back and found a shed. The moment the door creaked open, Echo growled. Inside was a cot, a bucket, and a latch secured from the outside. Don stepped back, shaken. This wasn't a shed, he said aloud. It's a cage. A warrant was issued within the hour. Inside the residence, investigators uncovered a vast collection, files stacked high, photographs, names, handwritten notes. Only one room was actively used. The rest had become storage, filled with boxes of clothing, worn-out shoes, even old-school ID cards. In the middle of it all sat Echo, exhausted, yet alert. 3 more victims were identified. Each had since been rescued and relocated. Their accounts were different at first, but ultimately led to the same truth. 1 man, 1 coordinated operation, and 1 dog that never stopped searching. Dan reunited with Lily during a school event. The organizers had asked him to bring Echo along. She was in the front row, taller, now her hair neatly braided. When she saw Echo, she rushed forward, wrapping her arms around him. I told my class, you saved me, she whispered. But I know you don't like the spotlight. Dan smiled. He prefers people like you over cameras. Later that evening, Don sat on the porch, Echo at his side. The breeze was gentle. No sirens, no pressure. He looked down at his partner. Feeling tired? Echo blinked slowly. Don leaned back. We might not catch all of them, but you gave us a fighting chance. Echo rested his head on Dan's boot. The mission wasn't finished, but for the first time, it felt like they were making progress. Dan Ruiz wasn't the type to break rules without reason, but when you've spent years pursuing shadows, ones that move, breathe, and vanish before you can catch them, rules can start to seem more like blindfolds than safeguards. So when the FBI sealed the case, Don didn't protest. Quietly, he made copies of all the evidence. 2 weeks had passed since the discovery at the remote ranch with the yellow steps. 3 girls had been reunited with their families. 2 suspects had been discreetly arrested in other counties, connected by clues, found in the files, but the man in the black SUV, he still hadn't spoken. No name, no prior record, not even a fingerprint. Silence. Some believed he was a pawn. Others thought he was something far more dangerous. Dan thought he was both. And Echo still didn't rest. He paced through the night, scratched at the same door, and stared into shadows longer than he should. Dan recognized those signs. It meant something remained unfinished. Someone was still out there. Don met Mia at a quiet diner just off Interstate 84. She was already seated in a booth by the window, a cup of coffee waiting. "I'm exhausted," she said, before he could sit. "Hey," he replied. They shared a look, the kind born from shared trauma. "Any news?" he asked. "The feds are staying quiet," she said. "They think, if they stop talking, the media will lose interest." "They're wrong." She leaned in. "I got a call from a foster home in Sheridan. A girl said she saw a man watching her school." Don raised an eyebrow. She described the SUV. Same as before. Even mentioned a limp. "A limp," Don echoed. "Yeah." He leaned back, piecing it together. "There was a fourth dugout," he murmured, "near the barn. Small, barely used." "I remember," Mia said. "You think it was his?" Dan didn't answer. Under the table, Echo shifted. His ears twitched. "He's not done," Don said quietly. "No," Mia replied. "He's not." By the following morning, Dan had made up his mind. No more waiting. Dressed in civilian clothes, he and Echo headed to Sheridan. No badge, no announcement, just quiet surveillance. The school sat near open farmland, with a church across the road. It was the perfect place to observe without being noticed. Don parked 2 blocks away and walked Echo along the perimeter. Their first pass revealed nothing. But on the second round, Echo paused near a row of trash bins. He lowered his head, sniffed, then growled. Dan crouched beside him. Hidden beneath damp cardboard was a white baseball cap plane, but inside the brim, almost too faint to see, was a single letter S. Dan bagged it without a word. They stayed in town, sleeping in the truck behind an abandoned gas station. Echo curled up in the passenger seat, eyes alert even while resting. Around 2 a.m., Echo sat up sharply. Don stirred. "What is it?" Echo exhaled, then locked his gaze out the windshield. A black SUV crept through the main intersection. No headlights, no sound, just movement. Dan's heart pounded. He waited until it turned the corner, then started the truck and followed, keeping the lights off. They trailed it to an old trailer park just beyond town. The SUV parked at lot 27. No one got out. Dan watched. Minutes passed. Echo growled, low and steady. That was enough. Don didn't call the local police. There wasn't time to be told to wait. He grabbed his flashlight and sidearm. Echo followed without a command. They moved silently toward the trailer metal siding, rusted front porch, sagging. No lights. Dan climbed the steps. Knocked once, nothing. Knocked again. A shuffle inside, then silence. "Sheriff's Department," he called. "Open up." No reply. Then a crash. Rear window, running footsteps. Dan and Echo raced around back. A figure limped across the field. "Echo, go." The dog launched, hitting the man mid. They crashed to the ground. Dan cuffed him seconds later. The man trembled, but still didn't speak. Don searched his wallet. No ID. Tucked inside the cash was a photo of a girl. Not Lily, not one of the others. Someone new. The man was turned over to federal custody by morning, quiet processing, as if it were routine. But Dan had one more task. The photo led him to a small town 3 hours east, population under 1,000. The girl's name was Emily. She had vanished 2 months prior. Locals had assumed she'd run away. Dan knocked on her mother's door and handed her the photo. She collapsed. Echo stood quietly behind Dan, tail low, head bowed. Emily was found a week later in a locked basement. 3 counties away, she was alive, barely but alive. Back at the station, Don found a letter in his mailbox. It was from the sheriff. You're officially suspended pending review of unauthorized field action. Dan folded the letter and dropped it in the trash. He walked out to his truck. Echo was waiting. They drove home in silence. No radio, just the wind, and the quiet rhythm of Echo's tail tapping the back seat. Dan didn't need the badge. He had Echo, and together, they were still doing what mattered, still hearing what others ignored. Still chasing the things everyone else had already given up on, and they weren't finished yet. It felt strange not wearing the badge anymore. After 15 years in uniform, Don Ruiz felt exposed without it. Not just because it wasn't on his chest, but because the things it symbolized, authority rules, safety, felt too limited after everything he and Echo had been through. Sometimes, doing what was right meant stepping outside the lines, and sometimes it meant putting more faith in a dog than in a command chain. The town stayed quiet about what had happened. No headlines, no radio reports. The black SUV had been impounded. 2 more hidden storage locations were discovered across state borders. In total, 5 girls had been rescued. One of them, Emily, still hadn't said more than a few words since she was found. Another filled every crayon drawing with dogs, large ones with kind eyes and gold badges on their collars. Dan never sought recognition, but he remembered each of them. Every single one. Echo had slowed down. The years of fieldwork had settled into his bones. On cold mornings, his limp was more noticeable, and his sleep came deeper and longer. The once razor-sharp alertness in his eyes had softened with time. But if Dan reached for his boots and opened the truck door, Echo would still get up, tail-wagging eyes, saying, "We're not finished." Dan never turned him down. He just drove. Then one day, a teacher named Hannah from Lincoln Elementary contacted him. She'd heard about Echo through a few quiet conversations and asked if they might visit her 4th grade class. "We've been talking about courage," she wrote, "but they don't know what it looks like yet." Don agreed. That Friday, Echo wore his old canine vest. It was faded and scratched, but it still held strong. Dan stood before a group of curious kids, still sipping the last of their chocolate milk from lunch. He didn't talk about news stories or arrests. He told them the quieter parts, how Echo would wait silently in the dark, how he could track fear like a scent, how he never barked unless it mattered. "He's not magic," Dan told them, resting his hand on Echo's back. "He's just a dog that never gives up. Not even when we want to." A boy raised his hand. "Did he ever save you?" Don smiled. "More times than I could ever count." Afterward, the children came up, one at a time, to pet Echo. Some were shy, others bold. One little girl leaned in to whisper in Echo's ear, like he was holding her secrets. Another slipped a treat into Dan's hand and said, "He earned it." Echo accepted it gently. That evening, Dan sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the golden fields. Echo lay nearby, snoring quietly. Don took a slow sip of beer and murmured, "We did good, partner." Echo didn't stir, but his tail thumped twice. A few weeks later, a call came from the governor's office. They wanted to name a new canine search and rescue program after Echo. Dan nearly declined, but Mia convinced him otherwise. "This isn't for you," she said. "It's for the next kid, and the dog that finds them." So he agreed on one condition: no fancy buildings or flashy ceremonies. Instead, he asked for something practical, a fund that would take in shelter dogs like Echo once was and train them for canine work in departments that couldn't afford the resources. They called it Echo Response. In its first year, Echo Response trained 7 dogs. 4 of them went on to locate missing children across the Pacific Northwest, to become emotional support animals in public schools. One was retired early and adopted by Leah, the first child Echo had ever rescued. She named her dog Ranger, Don. Never wore the badge again, but the phone still rang. Detectives, teachers, parents. "Could you come speak to our volunteers?" Would Echo sit with a child during a court hearing? "Would you mind taking a look at something?" Don never asked for payment. He always showed up. Then one morning, just before Christmas, Don awoke to find Echo gone. Not missing. Outside, lying peacefully in the yard, facing the sunrise. His tail was curled gently around his legs. Don knelt beside him, said nothing for a long while, let himself cry. Then he whispered, "You found your last one, didn't you?" They buried him beneath the oak tree near the house. Neighbors came. So did many of the children he'd helped over the years. They were older now, taller, but their eyes still softened when they looked at the leash, now empty. Mia placed his vest on a chair. Dan didn't make a speech. He simply said that Echo never stopped listening, and never stopped feeling. That was enough. In the months that followed, Dan built a bench under the tree. People began to leave small tribute stuffed animals, flowers, sandwich bags with dog treats. One child left a note in crayon. Echo didn't talk, but I heard him. Don still drove. Still walked along school fences and dirt roads. Still breathed the air like he was listening for the next whisper for help. He trained one more dog, not as sharp, not as fast, but eager. One day, during a school fire drill, that dog froze. He had heard something, a soft, scared sound. Moments later, he found a 6-year-old, locked in a janitor's closet, too afraid to call out. Dan smiled. Maybe Echo hadn't really gone. Maybe the best parts of him lived in instinct, in compassion, in the refusal to turn away. Echo's journey reminds us that heroes don't always come in uniform. Some walk on 4 legs, without words, and still manage to speak volumes.